The Canadian real estate market is in absolute crisis mode right now, as the Canadian Real Estate Association lowers its sales guidance for 2023, and a Scotiabank Economist is suggesting that the forward guidance provided by the Bank of Canada, and I quote, deserves a place on the fiction shelves at your favorite bookstore or the virtual equivalent. Yes, that's right. Once again, shots fired from Derek Holt of Scotiabank. And at the same time, average rental rates have hit an all-time high, and the Office for the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, the banking regulator, is trying to rein in 90-year amortizations. I think it's safe to say we've hit hell in a handbasket mode. But before we get into all the details, my name is Nolan Matthias, and if you want the latest Canadian financial and real estate news, this is the place for you. And if you're watching this video and you don't realize that this is a different channel than the previous one that you may have watched, make sure you hit the subscribe button, because this is where the old school news information that so many of you love is going to be placed going forward. Okay, so let's get into it. This one is going to be a doozy. In fact, this could be one of the most information-packed videos I have ever done on this channel, or the previous one for that matter. Because as of right now, we have the Canadian Real Estate Association downgrading its sales forecast, which, by the way, was a little bit optimistic to begin with. CREA, the Canadian Real Estate Association, yes, that's CREA, not the CREA, they go by the name CREA, not the letters, has now downgraded sales forecasts as interest rates weigh on buyers. And they are now acknowledging that they are seeing fewer buyers jump into the market. The association expects 464,239 properties to trade hands this year, a 6.8% decrease from last year. And as we all know, last year's numbers were down substantially. It now also predicts 516,000 being sold in 2024. In an April forecast, CREA said it expected 492,000 sales. So this revision is a reduction of about 28,000 sales, which was a 1.1% drop. Now, I think that as we get into more higher interest rates and the fall market hits and probably shows at least some signs of slowing, that this number is probably going to end up being even lower than what CREA has revised it to. And for context, they previously predicted the 2024 numbers to be 561,000 sales. Now, that being said, they have revised up the average sale price because we are still seeing sale prices increase due to low amounts of inventory, which is putting upward pressure on prices. So previously they had expected that housing prices would on average be 670,000. They are now forecasting that they will be 702,000. And I do believe that this number will pan out pretty close to what they have predicted. So while their sales forecast is going down substantially, their average price forecast is going up. And again, that's largely due to the lack of supply. But here's where things get really interesting, because one bank economist is now suggesting that the forecast going forward is complete fiction. In other words, the Bank of Canada is forecasting that inflation is going to taper out later than expected in order to make sure that Canadian bond yields on midterm yields remain high. Now, this is where we have to get into some economic jargon and explain exactly what they mean by this. So, if the Bank of Canada pushes out the forecast for inflation rates to come down, what that does is it has an impact on the bond market yields. And what Derek Holt here is suggesting is that the Bank of Canada is trying to push out that forecast in order to prevent the bond market from having a rally, which would lower 5-year fixed rates. So in other words, what the Bank of Canada wants is they want the expectation to be that interest rates are going to remain higher for longer so that 5-year fixed rates don't come down, which would put upward pressure once again on the Canadian real estate market. And I find this really interesting because there's also a CIBC economist who is suggesting that the most recent rate hike was unnecessary as well. And what's even more interesting in my mind is that Derek Holt, the Scotiabank economist, is suggesting that if the markets start to act like interest rates are going to come down sooner than what the Bank of Canada is forecasting, that the Bank of Canada may in fact increase interest rates again in order to prove the market's wrong and stabilize those midterm rates. So to summarize what is otherwise a little bit of a more complicated topic, what Derek Holt is saying is the Bank of Canada just pushed out its inflation forecast in order to keep upward pressure on 5-year mortgage rates. And if this is true, it's kind of a sinister move on behalf of the Bank of Canada, albeit somewhat of a genius one. Now, while the Canadian Real Estate Association is downgrading its sales forecast and Scotiabank is calling the Bank of Canada forecast fictional, average rents in Canada have now hit an all-time high. And the data here is really, really staggering, because if you look at some of the biggest markets, a 2-bedroom in Vancouver now goes for $3,863. A one-bedroom unit is priced at $2,945, which means an average one-bedroom unit is pushing the $3,000 mark for a rental rate. And in Toronto, these numbers are $2,572 for a one-bedroom and $3,301 for a two-bedroom. Now, this is going to have an interesting effect because usually when rents go up this high, people start getting pushed into buying. But with interest rates as high as they are and housing prices as high as they are, they have to look at the economic cost of that. And if it doesn't make sense to purchase, they're going to continue to rent. The more upward pressure we have on rent, the more people are going to look to buy. And the more expensive it gets to buy, the more people are going to look to rent. So what we end up having is this upward spiral in rental and housing prices. And I've got bad news. This is not going to change until such time as we have more supply in the housing market, both on the sales side and on the rental side. And I have more bad news. The longer interest rates remain high and it seems unfeasible to build more product, well, the higher that both rents and prices are going to continue to go. Now, all of this has at least one organization really worried, and that's OSFI, the Office for the Superintendent of Financial Institutions. They are now suggesting that they are going to increase the capital requirements for mortgages that are variable rates with fixed payments. So this applies to lenders like BMO, TD, CIBC, and RBC. And what this means is that for every mortgage going forward that is of this type, the banks are going to be required to have more capital on hand, which means that the profit margins of those products are going to go down. And banks don't really like to see profit margins go down, so more than likely what they will do is they will start reducing the discounts available for variable rate mortgages going forward, which means in the near future, if these regulations go through, the banks are going to end up charging more for variable rate mortgages, meaning more and more people are going to be pushed into fixed rate mortgages, which if interest rates go down, means more and more people are going to be exposed to massive payout penalties and not be able to take advantage of future lower interest rates. So this is getting really, really interesting. The banking regulator is essentially going to start pushing people into mortgages that have high penalties, which means that a large amount of their equity is going to get eaten up if they want to change lenders, if they need to pay out their mortgage, or if they need to sell their house. So the next step, I believe, at some point, probably in 2024 or maybe 2025, if interest rates do go down, is that the regulators are going to start looking at payout penalties finally with the big banks and maybe put some rules into place with respect to how much they are able to charge. Because the single fastest way for somebody to lose a large amount of equity, especially in an environment where interest rates are starting to go down, is to have to pay those penalties, which are, in my opinion, predatory in nature. And it's really interesting. I've been at a conference the last couple of days. They've talked about how big pharma and big corps are getting beaten up all over North America, yet the big banks in Canada still remain some of the most trusted organizations, but they do things like charge exponential penalties for their 5-year fixed borrowers, among other things that they do that make those banks really, really profitable, but make them probably not the best places for Canadian consumers to do their investing and get their mortgages. Which means if there's way better options out there for those things, why are we as a country continuing to put so much faith and so much confidence in our banks that charge us a crazy amount of money just to hold our money? And if you want to know more about what's going on in the Canadian real estate market and with the Bank of Canada, specifically with the Bank of Canada, make sure you check out this video right here.